Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us live at the Basilica here at Shrine Little Flower. Tonight we have a very special guest, Father Tim Kesicki. He was actually here when I was here as a young man 25 years ago. And he, I shouldn't say that, right? This is aging him. But just wisdom, tons of wisdom. So you know that Father Tim grew up in Pennsylvania, Erie, Pennsylvania. He earned his bachelor degree in political science from John Carroll University, and then completed his philosophy studies at Loyola University in Chicago. Also, his theology studies were completed at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, California, and then he had studied in educational administration at the Teachers College in Columbia University in New York. So we have a very wise man. He was ordained a Jesuit in 1994, and then from 2000 to 2008, he was the president of St. Ignatius High School in Cleveland, Ohio. And then from there, he was, in 2008 and to 2014, he was the provincial of the Chicago-Detroit province of the Jesuit Society of Jesus. And then since 2014, he's been the president of the Jesuit Conference of the United States and Canada. He's in charge of he leads 2,500 brothers and priests under him. So he's a wonderful leader. But his most powerful and most gracious contribution was his time here at the shrine when he would preach. And I know that tonight he will regale you. You will not close your eye. You will be completely enwrapped. I want to just say that I enjoyed his company when I was here. He was an inspiration, and I want to thank him for joining us this evening. So please welcome Father Timothy Kesicki.
Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me fine. Father Horn recommended this wireless microphone, and I've always loved sort of the amphitheater of the shrine. I must say, I look at the familiar faces, and I won't name you all because the ones I don't name are going to be the only ones who remember that I named people. But it's a homecoming for me, and when Jack Crisula invited me to give this talk, I said, Detroit, the shrine, yes, and I'm so happy to be here. Jack actually helped me pick the topic, but I just want to share a very important memory of this parish. I was ordained a priest in 1994. And my first mission actually was in Uganda. I worked with refugees fleeing the civil war in Sudan. And for those of you who were here then, you heard many homilies about that very profound experience. And so the Sudanese refugees formed me as a priest. But immediately after that, I came to work at a joint effort of the Archdiocese and the Jesuits, Loyola High School in Detroit, which is in the city, 5 Mile in Fenkell. And I was a weekend assistant here. And I came here every weekend, where I learned to preach a Sunday cycle, where I did baptisms, weddings, and occasional funerals. And this parish formed me as a priest. And I thank you for that. A couple of years ago, I was at the University of Detroit, Jesuit High School and Academy, where I had taught as a Jesuit scholastic. And Brother Jim Boynton, who has a leadership role there now, said to me, I want you to meet someone. And so he brings me to a classroom, knocks on the door, asks for a student to come out, says the student's name and says, you know who this is? And I said, no. And he said to the young man, say your name. The kid said his name. Do you know who it is? I said, no. And he said, you baptized him 16 years ago. Now, in fairness, some of you haven't seen me for 25 years, but I look somewhat the same. I'm sorry, but an infant whom you baptized looks a little different at 16 in high school. But I was so consoled that night because to meet someone whom you baptized is the grace of ministry. The topic Jack Crisula and I talked about, and he asked me to address, is how do we get our young back to church? And I recognize that there's some young people here tonight. I'm not really speaking to you, nor am I speaking about you. I'm kind of speaking about those who are not here sitting next to you. And the topic of religious disaffiliation is a significant topic for us as a church. And I realize the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the demographics of the church, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about preceded that. I'm going to divide my talk into kind of three basic categories. First, the present, which is some of the sobering statistics affecting young people and their relationship to church. I'm going to take a look at the past, which I come from, and how the past can help us and not help us, and then look to the future. So what's the matter with past, present, and future? I'm only going to revert the order: present, past, and future. In 2015, the De La Salle Christian Brothers, I don't know if there are any alumni of De La Salle here, but I love the De La Salle Christian Brothers from France. And they have a publishing house called St. Mary's Press. And they published a book titled Going, Gone, The Dynamics of Religious Disaffiliation. And this book, which is not exactly a pick-me-up, after you read it, you might want to read the book of Job and all of Job's lamentations. It's not exactly a pick-me-up. Talks about the religious disaffiliation in young, and it's based on a lot of research which comes from the Pew Research studies. Now, I'm going to have to divide us into camps. I won't make you move pews, but who are the young? And so I have to define what the Going, Gone says by young. So I'm going to look at the generations. So the Pew Research talks about the silent generation. Tom Brokaw's more noble. He talks at the greatest generation, and those are born between 1928 and 1945. Then there are the baby boomers. I'm a late boomer, born in 62. Baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. Then comes Gen X. And Gen X kind of reflects the drop in birth rate. They were born between 1965 and 1980. Then there's millennials, which Pew Research divides into two groups, older and younger. Older millennials were born between 1981 and 1989, younger millennials between 1990 and 96. And now my nieces and nephews are Gen Z, as they like to tell me, born between 1997 and 2012. These aren't exact separations, but I think they're helpful for us. The young that the Pew Research study has looked at are primarily younger millennials, some bleeding over into Gen Z. And so the data I'm going to share with you about the present is related to that group. The Pew Research study, which Going, Gone published, suggests that among young millennials, about 36% of Catholics aged 18 to 24 are disaffiliated from the church. And of older millennials, those who are aged 25 to 33, about 34% are disaffiliated from the church, which means we have just slightly over a strong third of our flock that does not claim to be Catholic. If you look at this in the context of, remember, Catholics aren't the majority, no, but we are the plurality in the United States. And if you look within that plurality, 12.8% of young adults in the U.S. between 18 and 25 now identify themselves as former Catholics. And approximately 6.8% of U.S. teenagers between 15 and 17 are former Catholics. Now, I can go on and on and on, but one of the monikers that this book, Going, Gone, the De La Salle Christian Brothers highlighted, they didn't coin the expression, but they published it, is this term called nuns. They're not sisters with veils. It's not N-U-Ns, it's N-O-N-E, nuns. And some of you are nodding, you're familiar with this. Nuns are people who no longer associate themselves with any religion. And when you look at some of the reasons why people, a third, more than a third now, are disaffiliating from our church, particularly younger millennials and Gen Z, they cite the following reasons. Some fall under a group called the injured. And the injured, for some reason, were injured by the church. Now, we know the abuse crisis, and that can be connected to it, but that's a smaller percentage. Some feel that either their rights or their beliefs were violated, their family was somehow harmed, that somehow the church did something to them that injured them, and because of that, they've left the church. Some are drifters. They're simply uncertain about their commitment to any faith or their engagement with any organized religion. And then some are dissenters. They feel that their belief system is in opposition to what our church believes, and so they have dissented. And the 6 kind of common dynamics of disaffiliation are these: an event or series of events or insights triggered by a process of questioning or doubt. Cultural secularization has led some to see the faith and religion amongst many options, and they feel that it's theirs to choose what they believe in. Some feel that they were unhappy being associated with the church, and there's a sense of freedom, a sense of liberation separating from the faith. Some say that religion was forced on them as children, that it was chosen for them, and now they want to choose their own. And others say that living a moral life doesn't require religious affiliation. Whether believer or disbeliever, some believe that unless they receive a pure, rational argument for why being connected to a church is given, they will not claim a religion. I'm not here to evaluate those, only to say that I can't talk about religious affiliation based on my own anecdotal experience or what I see in the pews in any church. I have to rely on the studies, which Pew Research and also the Center for Applied Research and the Apostolate at Georgetown University have done, and how these two have helped inform this text, going, gone. So that's the present, and some of the reasons why young people state they're not in the pews. But I had a radio interview actually on Ave Maria radio with Teresa Tomeo, and she said, well, what about the relationship between parents and the young? And she said something which I was actually going to talk about tonight, is we know in baptism that parents are our first teachers in the faith, that when we baptize a child, we say to you parents, you will be this child's first teachers in the faith. And we have to ask the question, what's the relationship between the young and their families? And how might that affect this increasing disaffiliation that's happening between the young and their presence in church? And I'm going to turn to actually an older study from a sociologist out of the University of Notre Dame by the name of Christian Smith. In 2005, and I realize this is an old book, he wrote a text called Soul Searching. He later wrote another book called Souls or Lives in Transition, in which he did a pretty serious sociological study on the religious beliefs and patterns of the young. And I have to say, by the 2000s, by the millennium, I would often hear this line, young people are spiritual, but they're not religious. I would always hear that. And so they like spirituality, they like spiritual programs, but when it comes to a denomination, when it comes to a particular religious affiliation, they're not going to stake claim to one. And Christian Smith did a sociological study, and what he found was actually somewhat contrary to that. He said, maybe there are some who claim to be spiritual and not religious, but that's not what the data suggests. He said, most of the people I interviewed, and he had a sample study of some 262, he said, most of the people I interviewed identify with the religion of their family, identify with the religion of their baptism, and they still claim it. But he said, it's amazing how few of them can articulate the central beliefs, the central tenets, can show an understanding of that faith. And he said it's mostly prevalent among mainline Protestant religions. He said among mainline Protestants, and we think of Episcopals, Presbyterians, Methodists, Lutherans, Baptists, and now the growing evangelicals, there's a lack of articulation of their faith. And second behind that group are Catholics. He said it's not so much that they don't identify with their faith. It's that they don't really understand or know their faith. Christian Smith went on to identify, this was in 2005, and he was studying maybe 13 to 16-year-olds, 3 dynamics of this generation. And he said that when it comes to faith, many of them have a sense of morals. They have a sense of right and wrong. And they live out of that sense of right and wrong, so they are moralistic. But then he said many of them come to church expecting a certain therapeutic quality to it. Like, church should make me feel good. It should leave me singing. It should uplift my spirit, not necessarily challenge me, not necessarily invite me into sacrifice, but it should feel good. Therefore, he said they're therapeutic. And the third thing he noticed, and this was the most painful one to me, was he cited an old belief system that actually was the belief of some of our founding fathers called deism. And deism believes that God set the world in motion and then walked away. I know a few cooks who are that way, actually. They set the meal in motion and then they walk away. But deism basically acknowledges that there is a God, acknowledges that God made the world, acknowledges that God created us, but that ongoing relationship with God, prayer with God. I'm a Jesuit in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius Loyola, we believe that interpersonal relationship with Jesus Christ is not present in deism. God did it, God walked away, now go on with your lives. And Christian Smith, in his book Soul Searching, The Religious and Spiritual Lives of American Teenagers, said, until we invite people into a deeper relationship with God, will they claim their own religion? And I said this was a bit of a dated study, but I look at it because one of the things Teresa Tomio and I were talking about was the relationship of parents to the young. And when we look at parents today, and I'm not impugning or judging anyone present in this basilica tonight, but how well catechized have we been? How well formed? How capable are we to articulate what the church teaches amidst the pervasive challenges, what we read in the news, what we see tearing the church apart, what we see tearing people apart? How able are we to articulate that? And so when we look at the present, we have to pray and reflect on the fact that more than a third of our young people are disaffiliated. And one of the most striking statistics of that disaffiliation is the average age is about 13. That really, it's happening in middle school or even before high school, where younger people who are now disaffiliated are claiming that they're separated from the church. The topic of this is bringing our young people back, filling the pews. In light of this data, what are we called to do? I want to look at my own upbringing and my own experience. I want to take a little of a look at the past. And I don't want to look at the past in a nostalgic way. I don't want to somehow suggest that the past was better than the present and if only we could go to the past, because that would be disingenuous. But I want to look at the past and ask, what could it teach us about the present? Now, the first thing I have to tell you is that I grew up in a very robust Catholic culture. On my street, all but one, we had a Lutheran family, but all the others were Roman Catholic. And I grew up in an area where we went to parochial schools, where our churches were bursting at the seams, and so it's primarily what we knew. And it was also, we were culturally Catholic. It wasn't just something that we learned or were baptized into. It was, even our humor was Catholic. And I'm going to say something, I hope it doesn't offend you, Father Horn, but I remember as a high school kid serving benediction. And I think most of you know what benediction is. And now I do not mean to body shame the pastor, but let's say that the pastor was a friend of the skillet. He knew his groceries. He was no stranger to the table. I realize that might be politically incorrect, but I'm just going to say it because I'm having to set up how our humor was Catholic. And at one point we're kneeling and the pastor chants, "You have given them bread from heaven." and the server next to me chants in my ear, "And he ate it all." I'm sorry, Father. I'm sorry, Father. Okay, that shows you. I do not think that young people today would even get that humor. And I'm no judgment on them. What I'm trying to say is that I grew up in a world that was just imbued with Catholicism. We didn't know any different. I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania, which is a very Catholic place. When I was studying out in California, as was mentioned, I met somebody in San Francisco who was from Erie. And the first thing I said is, "What parish?" And he said, "Oh my God, you are from Erie." And he said, "St. Luke's." And he said, "Actually, we're Jewish, but we knew our synagogue was in St. Luke's Parish." I mean, that's the world that I grew up in. And I went to parochial school. And believe it or not, in the late 1960s, early 70s, almost 10%, slightly over 10% of all U.S. school children were under Catholic auspices. And it's so tempting for me to think that was the norm. I mean, and when I was a kid, I thought, okay, Jesus was born, Merry Christmas, and then he died and rose, Happy Easter, and then Sister Immaculata opened Sacred Heart School, and the rest is history. No, that's not how it happened. And I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to study how the United States reached more than 10% under Catholic auspices. And I think if we look at that trajectory, we have to ask ourselves, how did that historic trajectory lead to then? What is the historic trajectory now? And what is it calling us to do? And so I want to take a little moment, because my background is more in Catholic education than in parish ministry, to say, how did we get to the mid-60s, the late 60s, the early 70s, where so many were in Catholic schools? Because it might surprise you to know that the first Catholics to come to the United States, and I'm going to highlight one, Archbishop John Carroll, who was the first Catholic archbishop, was not a fan of parochial schools. Archbishop Carroll recognized that the U.S. was a new experiment, that it was a pluralistic democracy, that by constitution it did not have an established religion. And Archbishop Carroll said, it will be important for Catholics to mix with all other people so that we can, and he used this term, assimilate into U.S. society. It didn't mean that we would change our beliefs, but we would be part of this new creation, which was the United States. And the Carrolls were signers of the Declaration of Independence. They were signers of the United States Constitution, and this was something he favored. And many favored that. I remember studying at Columbia Teachers College, and Horace Mann is one of the big names there. And Horace Mann believed in the Common Schools Project, that if we could establish a common school system in the United States, we could bring together all people of the United States. Why didn't that happen? Well, the Common Schools Project said that those schools would never discriminate, but they did. And in terms of the Catholic perspective, there's been discrimination across the board, racial, gender. But I want to speak specifically to Catholic discrimination. By the late 18th century and the 19th century, Catholics were heavily discriminated against in the school system. There was something called the McGuffey reader. I used Dick and Jane readers, my name's Jane, my dog's Spot. See Spot, run, run Spot, run. I don't know how many of you had the Dick and Jane readers. I did, but everyone had a reader. Well, there were the McGuffey readers, and they were to help teach children how to read. But the McGuffey readers were very anti-Semitic and very anti-Catholic. So if you take at that time, the Mass was in Latin, and the words of consecration were hoc est enim corpum meum, this is my body. And the McGuffey reader had magicians using the words hocus pocus. And I don't know if you ever were a kid and you did hocus pocus, that's kind of blasphemous, because what you're doing is you're mocking the words of consecration. I did it as a kid, we didn't know it. But you had that in the reader. You had something called the Blaine Amendments, and the Blaine Amendments sought to block any funding of religious schools and even thought to prohibit religions who were accountable to an outside non-U.S. authority from practicing in the United States. We see some of that in mainland China today. And so that was the second wave. And then you had really pretty nasty chants about our faith. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the gunpowder plot, but there was a lot of English resistance to Catholicism. There was a belief that Catholics tried to blow up King James in the Houses of Parliament. So, I mean, imagine you were going to a public school where they said, remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason, and plots. I see no reason why Catholic treason should ever be forgot. Or imagine a mother, let's call her Mary McDermott, that's a pretty Catholic name, with her children Andrew and Elizabeth walking by her kids' new playground and hearing a penny loaf to feed the Pope, a farthing of cheese to choke him, a pint of beer to rinse it down, a bundle of sticks to burn him in a pint of tar, burn him like a blazing star, burn him body from his head, and then we'll sing Old Pope is Dead. The anti-papist, anti-Catholics, sentiments of the 19th century were pervasive. And so before there was a U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, there was the Plenary Councils of Baltimore. And the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore in 1866 suggested that parishes are at Catholic schools. By 1884, the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore, they mandated that parishes erect Catholic schools. So John Carroll's assimilationist, we should be part of the American school experiment, fell because of the religious discrimination, which led to the parochial schools. That's 1884. 2000, you got all the wave of immigrants coming primarily from Europe, but other parts of the world. Catholic big families with the heir and spare. Only one could get the family business, so the others, many of them became priests and nuns. And you just draw the trajectory, and you see the mandating of Catholic schools, the wave of immigration, the families giving priests and nuns, and in 1965 you have more than 10% of U.S. children under Catholic auspices. What I thought as a child was the norm was in response to that history. We see other examples of challenges to our faith today. We see other challenges of disaffiliation, which we're talking about here tonight. How do we learn from the 19th century to the 20th century, which many of us were formed in, to go now from the 20th century to the 21st century, utilizing the same courage that our predecessors did? Now, there's sometimes I think, if we could only just go back. If we could go back in time, if we could go back to 1959, everything would be fixed. Only we can't go back in time. There are two scholars at the University of Chicago, Martin Marty and Scott Appleby, and they wrote a lot on what they call the fundamentalism project. And they talk about fundamentalism as a selective reclamation of the past. You choose some things from the past and go back to them, but you don't really fully go back to the past. And so when I hear some people say, we just need to go back to 1959 or 1961 or 1949, whatever their desired year is, then we can restore the faith. Then people will come back. And their challenge is this. Would you really want to go back to 1959? Does any of us want to go back to the communications of 1959? I happen to like my cell phone. When I grew up, we had one phone in the house. And I don't know how many of you remember the party line. Can you imagine children today going back to one phone in a party line? Now that's kind of a supercilious example. But if you want to go back to the past because you think it's going to bring back people to the faith, do we want to go back to the way women were treated in 1959 and where the glass ceiling was then, where no woman would be a president of a university, a member of Congress, a head of a corporation? Do we want to go back to that? Do we want to go back to before the civil rights era? Do we want to go back to the racial discrimination of the 50s, which I don't judge them as evil or wrong, but we know where we've come since then? Do we want to go back to the educational experience of then? Do we really want to go back in time? Unless you have a time machine where you can go back completely, you can't go back to the past to try to fix the future. We have to learn from the past and say, what does it teach us for the future? And when I think of what the past taught me as I look to the future, I'm going to highlight three things. First thing I know the past taught me was that the family was the root of my faith, and that faith has to be rooted in culture. Even when people complain about Christmas as becoming too secular, Christmas admits that Jesus was born. Christmas admits that Jesus is our Savior. Christmas admits that God became one like us. Christmas is but one example of Catholic culture. Family and culture are essential for the faith. I fear that sometimes people disaffiliate because their culture is no longer fundamentally rooted in faith. Faith is extracurricular. It's an add-on. It's something we do when we feel we need to. That's the first thing that I know I've learned from the past. The second is this, that our identity was as Catholic. And I realize that we have many identities. We have identities to political parties. Some of us have identities to where we're born or what state we're from. Some of us have identities connected to what clubs we belong to or what schools we graduated from. And those are all important. But how much is our Catholic identity central? And how much do our young identify their Catholic identity? So family and culture, identity. And the third I'm going to say is this: God first. That's the one thing from my childhood. We always knew that God came first. And if we ever strayed, if we ever felt confused, if God wasn't part of it, there was no way of moving forward. So as I look at the past, we have to understand how the past helped to build up the church. We have to understand how the church has undertaken discriminatory or difficult circumstances and risen above them. But the past can only inform the future, and we have to take the fundamental faith from the past into the future. Let's move to the future now. As I look to the future, I have to ask myself, where do I see hope? Where do I see promise? And the first area is we have to catechize. We have to teach. We have to have a fundamental understanding of our faith. But if I think that, I love the speaker series, but if I think that a speaker series alone, if I think that even Sunday Mass alone is going to accomplish that, I think I've set the bar too low. And just as I held this up before and said, I don't think I want to trade this for the party line, this is more than a telephone. We know that social media and new forms of media are a mechanism for spreading the faith. They're also a way to tear people apart. I'd like to say something how I hope social media can be a way for the future. I don't know how many of you know the work of Bishop Robert Barron. He has Word on Fire. He's from Chicago. He's an auxiliary bishop now in Santa Barbara. I think he's a tremendous example of hope for the future because I think he catechizes with vigor. And when he had to leave Chicago, he appointed Father Steve Gurneau, a priest of the Archdiocese of Chicago, to take on Word on Fire, to administer it. And I heard a podcast with Father Steve Gurneau called The Monsters of Social Media. I think the title Monster got my attention. And what he said was this. He said, I want to compare social media to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And I said, okay, you got my attention. Compare social media to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And he said, what did we learn from Frankenstein? I grew up watching it. I don't know how many of you did, but Frankenstein makes a monster. But the monster's not good or bad. The monster doesn't know right from wrong. The monster goes out in the world and learns how to behave based on what the monster experiences from other people. And because Frankenstein isn't exactly going to be on the cover of Vogue, Frankenstein is a pretty hideous creature. Frankenstein experiences anger, hatred, threats on his life, and Frankenstein turns into a monster. Something that wasn't designed to be a monster, but learns from us how to become a monster which leads to the death of Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster. Now, Father Steve Gurneau says, I believe social media is the same. He said when they started social media, and I'm not going to name all of them, I know some of you are on Facebook, some of you are on Instagram, some of us on Twitter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The algorithms that designed them were designed to do one thing, to increase our screen time. The more time I spend like this, the better I am, and the more advertising revenue can be generated. And so the algorithm first figured out, keep them in front of their screens, and then the algorithm said, well, what keeps them in front of their screens? Well, all the great sins keep us in front of our screens. Rage keeps us in front of our screens. Vengeance keeps us in front of our screens. Pornography, lust, all the 7 deadly sins keeps us in front of our screens. And regrettably, social media has turned into that. And it's tearing us apart. And it is a factor in disaffiliation. So as we look to the future, he says, how can we as Catholics use social media to evangelize, to preach, to teach, to uplift, to raise up? And some of us might say, well, God, I have a hard time balancing my checkbook on my cell phone. How can I use social media? But we have to all support, especially in our young, how they engage it and how they use it for the future. A few years ago, I was at a conference of major superiors of men, and we had a presentation from Mr. Curtis Martin, who started a group called Focus. And Focus provides campus ministry on many university campuses. As I listened to him speak, he talked about the magic of Focus was he called peer mentorship. He says, we take young people, we train them to be missionaries, we send them into the universities, and we help them to accompany the young. And he said, well, I respect the work of campus ministries in our universities. He said, by the time many of them get their degrees, their graduate degrees, receive a position, there's already a gap between them and the young. He says, taking the young and putting them with other young and training them how to evangelize, how to catechize is a good thing. And I had to reflect on how I became a Jesuit. When I think of how I became a Jesuit, yes, I came from a strong Catholic family. Yes, I was inspired by the priests who first helped me think about becoming a priest. I was inspired by the Jesuits who taught me in university and gave me the spiritual exercises. But I remember my first visit to the Jesuit novitiate when I saw people my age, with my experience, doing this. I said, oh, now I can see myself in that role. And so I think a way for the future is, how can we take the young here and young together and help them mentor each other as peers? Help them to understand that it doesn't just come from adults. It's not just handed down from older or a hierarchical system, but there can be a peer way of connecting people together. This is, I believe, a hope for the future. I recently read a study that said how many people are disaffiliating from the church because of the scandals that have affected the church. And oddly enough, maybe 20 to 22%, this is the Center of Applied Research in the Apostolate, said about 20 to 22%. But we know that the church is a human institution, divinely inspired, but human. And as a human institution, how do we learn from the faults of the past? One of my favorite psalms is the 51st Psalm, a humbled, contrite heart, our Lord, you will not spurn. I believe a humbled, contrite church can help lead people. In the year 2000, now St. John Paul II issued an apology in the Jubilee year for the church and the faults of the past. And we know that one of the factors we have to address is that we're not a perfect church, we're a sinful church. When I was a Jesuit provincial, much of my work was reconciling with the abuse crisis, sitting with survivors of abuse, their families, apologizing, and through mediation, finding a way forward. I always found faith in the midst of an apology. Many of you, if you Google me, you will see that since I've moved to Washington, I was, as leader of the conference, woke up to the sin, the great sin of Jesuit slaveholding. And in 2016, we were able to meet the descendants of those whom we held, enslaved, and sold. And while the contrition has been painful, the relationship with Catholics who are trying to rectify this history with their own Catholic faith comes with moments of grace and hope. And we know that those are just some of the many sins of the church. A humbled, contrite church can attract people, can inspire people, can lead people. The final one I want to offer, and I think this is the most important thing for those of us here tonight, is while we have to keep our eye on those who are disaffiliated and the fact that a third of young people are not in our pews and do not associate with our faith, the greatest gift we can offer them is our witness to the faith. How do I, in my day in, day out life, witness what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a Catholic? And how do all of us do that? You know, this basilica is dedicated to Saint Therese. She's a young saint. She's a young believer. I've always loved her because in her youth, she gave her heart to God. Do we hold her up as the example to young people to say, you too could be like Therese? You know, Therese wanted to be a Carmelite like when she was in her early teens, and they told her no. And her family had an audience with the Pope, Pope Leo XIII, and it was just, kiss the hand. And she screams at the Pope, I want to be a Carmelite. And she doesn't leave. He says, go home. Trust the superiors. She doesn't leave. She stands there kneeling. The guards had to carry her away. That's witness. Today we celebrate the feast. It's an optional memorial, but we celebrate the feast of a great Ugandan saint, Saint Josephine Bakita. Josephine Bakita experienced great humiliation. She's a patron saint of those who experienced the horrendous sin of sexual trafficking because she herself experienced, rose above it, and came home to Jesus. How often do we uplift her story? How often do we uplift the lives, particularly of the young saints who gave their hearts to Jesus, and hold them as the models? We have so many heroes and models that we uphold: the young, athletic, movie stars, musical artists, models, people who seem to have what we don't have and want. When are we going to uphold those who have Jesus in their heart and say, they are the ones who will lead us? We have to uplift these, and we too have to give witness. I'm going to end with this line because I want to have an opportunity for Q&A, and we're only 15 minutes left. A saint who was canonized in 2019, John Henry Newman, he was an Anglican who became a Catholic, wrote something called the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, a defense of one's life. And in his Apologia Pro Vita Sua, he has these words: growth is the only evidence of life. Are we growing as a church? If not, how can we, so that we can truly show that we are full of life? Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention. You have been very cooperative, and I think this could be enhanced now by your questions and or observations and feedback.
If you have a question for Father, please raise your hand and I'll come to you with the mic. Chicken. Oh, there we are.
Yeah, so my name is Mike Christensen from St. Patrick in White Lake. Just a question on, I think we jump to catechesis a lot as the first step, but what about relationship with Jesus, and how do we root that first?
Thank you. So catechesis in relationship with Jesus, and I'm going to speak as a Jesuit. That relationship with Jesus is central. St. Ignatius Loyola, who's the founder of my institute, found that he was taught by God and privileged that relationship with Jesus. I would say, I love that question. I think, first of all, we have to give the young place for quiet, for where they can experience not constant conversation or chatter, but the beauty of silence. And I think the young like silence. I think they do. We have to make that available to them, because until you grow to embrace silence, it's hard to encounter anything except the stimulus of so much that is coming. I mean, it's hard because the very young, there's that, how much catechesis is necessary to know who Jesus is? I mean, and that's not an answer. That's an art. That's not a science. There's no way I can teach that. But the silence is essential. And, you know, I'm going to cite Therese. I'm going to cite Therese because I remember Bishop Patrick A. Hearn. I had dinner with him here when he was trying to get Therese made doctor of the church. And when he heard I was Jesuit, he said, "Oh, you Jesuits." He says, "With your Ignatian spirituality," he said, "if you liken the spiritual life to climbing the Empire State Building, Ignatius would have you climb all 101 steps, you know, thinking of your sins on the way up. Therese would say, we're taking the elevator to the top floor, the little way." And we should never overcomplicate who Jesus is. We should never try to over-theologize it. So I would say the two things I would say practical are the quiet, giving young people quiet time, and because I think they welcome it and love it, and then enough to know Jesus, but not so much to overwhelm them.
Anyone else?
Jack. Oh, in front of you.
In your role as the head Jesuit in America, I would assume you get to spend time with another Jesuit in Rome. What's the biggest thing you've learned from Pope Francis?
Yes. Well, I mean, there's so much written about him. I'll give I'll give two stories. I don't meet with him. I've been at meetings with him, but you know, I don't meet with him. I mean, I can share three stories that are more personal. Because so the very first time I met him in 2014, I had this whole like speech prepared because I was so nervous and I wanted to impress him. Stupid me. And I gave him this speech on who I was and what I did. And we're speaking in Italian, of course, and he looks at me like, "Flip you a fish." And then when I said, my dad's still alive, but my dad had cancer and he was having a kidney removed. I said, "Santo Padre, il mio padre aveva il cancro." My dad has cancer. He pulled me in. "What's his name? I'll pray for him." And I realized he's a pastor. He's not impressed with position. He's a pastor. That's the first thing I would say. The second is I was at a meeting there were 200 Jesuits. It was our general congregation. And we began with a prayer, and everyone's heads were down. But I was a little like, wow, you know, praying with the Pope. So I'm looking at him, and at one point his head comes up, and he catches me looking at him. And my first thing is, oh my God, the Pope caught me not praying. But then I just smiled, you know. And he smiled back. And I realized that prayer is not about performance, it's about encounter. And we encountered one another, and I think that was a grace. The third is just kind of his humor. The third time I saw him and I said that I was a Jesuit, sono Jesuita, and he said, "È la tua colpa," that's your fault. So I think he's very much a pastor, and so he's a pastoral theologian. He's a pastoral theologian. And I'm going to say I was born under John the 23rd, then Paul the 6th, then JP1, JP2. JP1 was only a month, of course. Pope Benedict the 16th. And I love the continuity of the papacy and how they build on each other. And so I think he comes out of the tradition of the great popes of my childhood, but as a pastoral theologian. And I think a humble man.
Thank you so much for being here. If, of the same era, Catholic school, Baltimore Catechism, it doesn't work today, as you illustrated. It's different. So if you were to do one thing today to change within the United States, to move youth, would it be the retreats, such as Focus for the college? Would it be reinstituting, at least around various regions of the United States, having youth ministers and support that position, which we've lost as well? And I guess if I picked three things, what would they be in an order such that if you could start today and have the means to do so, rewrite the Boston Catechism, different music in churches, what would we do?
Well, I appreciate that question. I'm going to go old school on you, okay? Martyrs are the greatest gift the church ever had. And for 300 years, the church was oppressed. And people who made sacrifices for their belief inspired immense people. And so I guess the first thing I'm going to say is there's a big sacrificial component of faith to me. And I think until we really make sacrifices for God, I think we're too much in control, and we might feel that God accompanies us, but we don't feel we need God. So I really love the first thing I would say is, we need to make sacrifices. When we feel pain, we shouldn't rush to make it feel good. We should feel the pain, because oftentimes it's in our deepest distress and our most sincere agony that we turn to God. And when we can emerge from that with a sense of humanity and a sense of hope, we recognize, how did I do that without God? And that goes back to the personal relationship with Jesus. But as we get older, if we don't really have those moments when we cry out to God, really, is it faith, or are we just observing something? So that's the first thing I'm going to say, and that is a bit old school. I think, and I appreciate the peer relationship in that. I think we have to share our faith more openly. I think there's almost a sense of religious tolerance has reached a point where we're so afraid of offending someone. We're so afraid of tripping over ourselves. We hide our faith. And I'm just going to share an interesting experience. I was making a presentation to the Kellogg Foundation in Battle Creek, Michigan, because I've been working with them on some of the work related to Georgetown University, the Jesuits, on our sinful history of slaveholding. And even though it's not a religious organization, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, I ended with faith and the importance of faith. And I remember I said, it was on a Zoom call, there were 80 people on it, and I said, I want to talk about faith, and even if you don't believe in God or you don't believe in an organized religion, I hope you have faith in something bigger than yourself. And as I'm saying this, the chat is exploding where people are saying, I am a faithful person, I'm a Christian, I love Jesus, I'm a Catholic, I do believe. And I thought people were just lunging to profess their faith. I think if I had assumed everyone was a believer, I might have gotten attacked. But because I acknowledge, I think people want to share that they're believers, but I think they're somehow afraid to. So I think that's the second thing. We should never be afraid to say that we believe in God. So the first is sacrifice. The second is we should never be afraid to say, yes, I love Jesus, and I'm a Catholic, and I love God. And then the third, and it's one of my favorite lines. I don't know who coined it, but every night I go to bed and realize that there is a God and I am not God. And that's prayer. And we have to trust that God loves us. God will find us. We can't stop praying for the young. We can't stop praying for the disaffiliated. We have to really be people of faith and not feel that we always have the answers. Maybe I've talked too much tonight, but that we kneel before Jesus and say, help them, help your church.
Hi, Father. I have a question with respect to Catholic schools. In the Detroit area, and I think probably throughout the country, we're seeing Catholic schools where students are not always Catholic today. And I don't see that as a negative, I see that as a positive. But how can Catholic schools still maintain their Catholic identity without, ostracizing their non-Catholic students?
Yeah. Thank you for your question, and I appreciate your line about not everyone in our schools are Catholic. When I was a weekend assistant here, I was at Loyola High School in Detroit, the joint effort, and only about 20% of our students are Catholic. And a former ninth Bishop of Cleveland, former president of the Bishops' Conference, when asked why he had Catholic schools in the city of Cleveland, always said, we're not there because they're Catholic. We're there because we're Catholic, and I think that's important. In terms of Catholic identity, I think we have to be clear that it's a Catholic school, and a Catholic school will teach this religion, will observe these religious practices, will uphold these central tenets and belief, And we invite people from all faiths to come and study that with us, but we're also not going to change it. And I have seen people from not just other Christian denominations, but other religions come to Catholic schools, hear about our faith, come to our masses and prayer services, and grow in their own faith, because they say, now I understand my faith in comparison to yours. So we can never water down our Catholicity. We can't water it down because we are not all, 100% Catholic. So thank you.
I want to thank you, Father Tim, for being here with us this evening. It's a great inspiration to have hope, right? To instill hope in us, and so you've done that. We are offering this service, these live at the Basilica events, free of charge. We want as many people to come, but it's also helpful for you to, if you could, participate in supporting this. So the ushers are going to start coming around with the basket, just for a free will offering, to help us to continue to cover the cost of offering this series. We also want to remind you that Catholic Foundation of Michigan is a sponsor. You can see at the bottom of Father John Riccardo's slide there. And it's the Catholic Foundation of Michigan inspires charitable giving and assists its donors in providing for the long-term needs of the Catholic parishes, schools, and ministries, and the nonprofit organizations of Southeast Michigan. So Angela Maloney, who is both the president and CEO, has a table set up in Heritage Hall. You can talk to her about maybe helping with that, and to offer maybe some ways in which you can participate in that. And ushers are also going to be passing out the next series, the flyer for Father John Riccardo, so please, if you can, receive those as well. Can I just ask us to thank Father for being here with us and to strengthen him and his ministry?
Thank you all. Thank you all so much.
Father, would you close us in prayer?
Well, let's take a moment to pray on this feast of St. Josephine Bakhita. Loving God, you open wide your hands and fill us with so many good things. You bless us with this beautiful parish, this incredible church, this center of faith where people come to find you and proclaim you. You bless us with the opportunity to share our faith this evening, and from our own humility, the desire to grow closer to you and to one another. And you bless us with the youth, some of whom are with us, some of whom are still wandering, but they're still part of us, and the opportunity you give us to know them better and invite them. As we go home, we ask you to bless our families, give us a peaceful sleep, and arouse in us the desire to do your will. We pray this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Also, of course, every time we have Live at the Basilica, we have a little refreshment, a little repast. So there's delicious cake and some refreshments for you in Heritage Hall, which is down by, I think that I can read it, door number 4. If you just go through there, you'll wind up having someone help you and be hospitable to you. Thank you so much for being here. God bless you, and have a good night.